People becoming blind is not a new phenomenon. Visually impaired persons were there in ancient times too. There are numerous references in Vedas, Quran, epics, Greek literatures, the Holy Bible, and stories about visually impaired persons and their plight. In ancient times, persons without vision were well taken care by the society, and it was also considered to be an important pious act. So, man has been witnessing blindness continuously since the dawn of the history, but so dominant is the role of vision, loss of vision labels a person as a disabled. Because of the disability, he may not do things that the others of the same age and sex do, such as walking, looking after themselves, eating, drinking, going to school, doing household tasks, doing a job, or participating in family and community activities, etc. Though visually impaired persons are capable of becoming independent, but they are kept dependent by the society and its own ignorance. Loss of vision leads to loss of mobility. The ability to move independently, safely, purposefully through the environment is a skill of primary importance in the development of each individual. If a person loses vision, it limits his locomotion and forces him to depend on others. Movement is central to the entire process of psychomotor development. Mobility is defined as a physical movement and the negotiation of any obstacle and hazards. It is the aim of obtaining freedom of movement without coming to any harm, safety in traveling as well as minimizing the level of stress placed upon a visually impaired person, while Braille gives intellectual independence. A well developed sense of mobility facilitates independent movement. It enables the person to detect hazards associated with traveling and to take evasive action. Mobility refers to total physical movement which involves a change in spatial location accomplished in upright position under one's own power. It describes all situations ranging from moving around within a single room in a house to a traveling from one town to another or even between countries. It is the action of traveling, of going one place to another. To be mobile, a person should be able to gather and use sufficient information from the environment to avoid hazards and to reach his destination safely. Thus, it is the ability to move in the environment in relation to oneself from one place to another. In order to do this, a visually impaired person may use long cane, a guide cane, or just a bamboo stick. And the definition of orientation. Orientation is the ability to locate oneself in one's environment. It is a skill that is related to the use of the remaining senses of a person to establish one's position in and in relation to significant objects in the environment. Orientation involves having an awareness of space and an understanding of the situation of the body within the process of using the available environmental information to select and follow the correct path is called orientation. It has been established that when a vision of a person is completely or partially impaired, he has to depend upon his remaining senses to be able to move around freely. The sense of hearing, touch, smell, kinesthetic and taste can all be used to help him to recognize his position in relation to the obstacles and landmarks around in the environment. Orientation and mobility training. The training that teaches the visually impaired persons to move around the environment freely and independently, known as orientation and mobility. The ability to move independently, safely, purposefully through the environment plays an important role in human development. The infant who learns travel, the toddler who takes her first step, and the child who negotiates stairs by herself are each recognized as having accomplished an important development task. Each of these accomplishments increase the status of the individual in the eyes of others as positive impact on his own self-concept. In 1800, a lawyer in United Kingdom who was blind had suggested the use of long sticks side by side for the mobility of the blind in the year 1819. A man called Johann Wilhelm had brought out an idea in his book, which was that training of dogs as guide to help the blind in their mobility. This idea after 100 years. Now, guide dog is one of the mobility aids to the visually impaired persons. In 1900, a rich blind man in England, name was not known, had tried a sighted person called James Holman to help the rich blind man to move around. James Holman was the first human guide to the blind as per the records available. After the First World War, 1914 to 1918, First World War had suddenly increased the number of blind in the world. Particularly, the number increased more in Germany than the other countries. Hundreds and thousands of soldiers became blind, and it had forced the German government to think about the blind soldiers and their rehabilitation. At the time of the war, dogs were used in the battlefield to carry medicines to the wounded soldiers. This gave an idea to train these dogs to guide the blind soldiers to move around. This idea became an action to start training dogs to guide blind persons. In 1917, an ambulance dog squad was formed in Germany to train dogs and help the visually impaired persons. Almost after 100 years, a suggestion of training dogs to help blind persons became true. Mrs. Eustace of United States of America was a very wealthy lady and was much kind towards visually impaired persons. She had heard about the guide dog training, and these dogs help visually impaired persons in their mobility. She was much interested and had visited to Germany. she had brought guide dogs and training instructors to United States of America to train blind persons in America. In 1927, Mr. Morris of USA was a lawyer and he became blind. He heard that dogs are trained to guide blind persons to move around. Mr. Morris went to Germany to get training to use guide dog for his mobility. After the training, he returned to USA with his guide dog called Buddy. Mr. Morris had toured the guide dog was so useful to him and he wanted that this benefit should go to other blind friends. Mr. Morris had started a seeing eye dog school at Morristown in New Jersey, USA, White Cane Law. In 1930, the Lions Club of Peoria, Illinois, USA had successfully lobbied for the first time White Cane Law. This White Cane Law was giving the right of way at the intersections to the blind persons carrying white wooden cane with red tip. In 1931, the Lions Club of USA adopted a national program to popularize the use of a white cane among blind persons, and the Lions Club distributed thousands of white canes free of cost. This white cane was heavy and of limited use in the conveying information about the environment. This white wooden cane had served principally the user as a blind person. Invention of the white long cane. After the Second World War, hundreds and thousands of American soldiers became blind, and this led to US military to establish rehabilitation program at 4 major hospitals in the United States of America. Dr. Richard Hoover, a renowned ophthalmologist, was working in the rehabilitation program as a doctor of physical conditioning, orientation and recreation. Dr. Richard Hoover and his team began experimenting with lightweight and longer sticks. Finally, Dr. Richard Hoover and his team designed lightweight aluminum cane and set of mobility techniques, and thus born a scientific white long cane and set of mobility techniques, which are basis of today's mobility training program. This great achievement spread all over the world in 1960. Boston College started graduate program called peripatology. In 1961, the Western Michigan University of America opened the Center for Orientation and Mobility. The Government of India invited Mr. Richard C. Jekyll, an American, an expert in orientation and mobility from Ellen Keller International, USA, to establish national program in India to train orientation and mobility instructors at the National Center, now National Institute for the Visually Handicapped, for the Blind, Dehradun, in 1972. National training program for the orientation and mobility instructors was shifted from Dehradun to New Delhi at Blind Relief Association in 1973. Mr. Y.J. Choksi, orientation and mobility expert, was appointed as course coordinator. Father Robert Coutinho, the director of Divine Light School for the Blind in Bangalore, Karnataka, had initiated to train staff and deputed many for this program. Mr. Y.J. Choksi visited this great institution in 1974 along with his trainees. He gave lectures about orientation and mobility, its importance in Lions Club and other organizations. In 1980, the first refresher course on orientation and mobility for practicing instructors, sponsored by UNICEF, was conducted at the National Institute for the Visually Handicapped, Dehradun. YMCA College of Physical Education, Chennai, Tamil Nadu, introduced a diploma course in orientation and mobility in 1980. In 1986, Rehabilitation Council of India approved the Orientation and Mobility Instructors Training Syllabus proposed by the National Institute for the Visually Handicapped. YMCA College of Physical Education, Chennai, introduced a degree course in Orientation and Mobility, BMS, Bachelor in Mobility Science, with Madras University affiliation in 1988. The Rehabilitation Council of India reviewed the Orientation and Mobility Instructors Training course for upgrading to a degree course in 1999. Mr. Aruldas Durairaj, course coordinator of Orientation and Mobility Instructors Training course, initiated and a degree course BMSc, Bachelor in Mobility Science, was introduced with affiliation from Gadwal University, Uttarakhand from 2006. Now, there are hundreds of orientation and mobility experts are working in government and non-government organizations to train visually impaired to move independently. Importance of orientation and mobility training. The ability to move independently in and around the environment is critical, and many a time the inability to do so affects the individual physically, emotionally. One of the main effects or impacts of blindness is in the ability to move around. Training in orientation and mobility would enable them to avail a variety of real experiences and enhance their understanding of the concepts, give them more confidence. The orientation and mobility training is important for the visually impaired persons for following reasons. Orientation and mobility training gives self-confidence. It acquires grace and personal importance. This training cultivates mutual understanding. It develops proper attitude towards sighted persons. O&M training enables them to learn self-awareness. It gives an opportunity to learn sense of responsibility. It helps them to make right decision. It develops communication skills. O&M training enables them for social integration. It develops total personality. Scope of orientation and mobility. Orientation and mobility training provides the skills and techniques necessary for the visually impaired persons to reach optimum level of independence, resulting in self-confidence and better interaction with people and environment. Proper mobility techniques widen the scope of experiences and make them to travel safely and efficiently with minimum risk and efforts. This training helps the individual concerned a basic conceptual framework to understand the environment and function more effectively within it. The visually impaired can use three methods of travel safely: walking with sighted guide, walking alone without a cane or sighted guide, walking by oneself with a long cane. Each of these methods has special rules and techniques that must be learned. It is important for the visually impaired to know these special techniques and to use them every time they move from place to place.